Swinburne University of Technology.
Thank you, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here in Melbourne. This is my first visit to Swinburne. And I'm really excited to be able to talk to you about something that I haven't talked about that much yet. In fact, we haven't even published anything about it yet. A new course that I started offering 3 years ago at Harvard. Now, those of you who followed my career know that I've worked in education for quite a while. I developed P-Instruction about 24 years ago, the clicker, learning catalytics, and so on. 3 years ago, my boss, the dean of the School of Engineering, offered me the opportunity to take a year off to completely rethink how we teach physics to engineering students. But reflecting back on what I did, the introduction of P-Instruction and interactive teaching was in a sense taking a flawed model, the lecture and the amphitheater, and try to improve the approach. Here my task was, let's wipe everything off the table and start thinking with a blank slate. If we were to design an ideal learning experience for students, what would it look like? So I took a year off. I traveled, I visited many innovative learning spaces, I read, and perhaps the thing that had the biggest impact on me was this book by Alan November. It was the beautiful title, Who Owns the Learning? It was actually a coincidence. I know Alan November. He's a consultant for K-12 education. And he had just started writing that book, or he just finished actually the manuscript for that book. And he wanted me to write a little blurb for the back cover. Well, there's one word that I have trouble pronouncing in my vocabulary. It's the word no. So even though I had absolutely no time, I said, sure. And the publisher sent me a copy of the manuscript, which went into my briefcase, and then happily traveled with me all around the globe for 3 months. I did everything to avoid reading it. But then on a long trans-Pacific flight, where I'd run out of power on all of my iDevices, and I'd read the in-flight magazine, and I had nothing to do. I pulled out that manuscript. And the first sentence of the foreword grabbed me. It was this sentence. Have you ever experienced something, some seemingly random event that made you completely reconsider the very essence of what you believed was true? I was hooked. He described, and this is just a foreword, he described something that happened to him in the early 80s, at the beginning of the personal computer era, right? The IBM PC just came out, and the Mac. And he was a high school teacher at that time in Lexington, Massachusetts, which is an affluent suburb west of Boston. And Lexington, Massachusetts, or Lexington High School, I should say, was one of the first schools in the US to have a computer classroom, and he was in charge of that computer classroom. On a Sunday morning, he gets a call that there's been a break-in in the computer classroom. Would you please come to school? So he drives the 40 minutes from his home in Marblehead to Lexington, parks his car. None of the windows of the classroom are broken. He goes inside, the door's not been forced open, looks inside, all of the computers are still there. There's just one strange thing. There's a student sitting at one of the computers. So he goes over to the students and says, Gary, what are you doing here? And Gary looks up at him and says, I want to learn how to program the computer. And that's when he realized that when somebody wants to learn something, they'll do anything. They'll break the law. I mean, you don't need to, give them exams and bribe them with points and this and that and the other. They'll just do it because of this ownership of learning. Look at small children. They're born learners. You can't stop them from learning. It is boundless curiosity about the world around us, asking why all the time. If anything, education does a really good job turning that ownership of learning, that desire to learn, off. For the lucky few among us, and I think educators fall in that category, that desire to learn typically comes back when we're in graduate school or maybe even later. So that had a big impact on me, and I thought, yes, I should really think of trying to create an environment where my students, engineering students and pre-medical students, who don't want to learn physics, they're there in my course because somebody tells them, you got to take this in order to meet the graduation requirements, so that they can actually take ownership. Now, as we all know, computers can be addictive, and if you really want to learn computer programming, it's easy to immerse yourself in that, but how do you do that with physics? And it became clear to me very early on in the planning process that I had to come up with some kind of a Trojan horse that hides the physics inside. And the Trojan horse that I came up with was actually a combination of two approaches: team-based learning and project-based learning. The team-based learning is there to create a social responsibility for the learning so that the students are responsible to each other rather than to me. They come to class prepared, they do their job, not because I tell them if you don't do it, you're gonna lose points. No, they come because they don't want to let their peers down. And then the project-based approach, which is actually the real Trojan horse, right? Rather than taking my book and giving that book to my students and saying, here, learn this, it's good for you, I tell them, we're going to work on this really cool project. And by the way, you might want to have a look at this book. So I want to, in the next 50 minutes or so, tell you a little bit about the design of this course, and then the approach that we use. And as you know, I've always been very data-driven in my approach to education research, just carrying that over from my work in optics. So I'll show you some preliminary results at the end. So to design this course, I used the approach that is advocated by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe in this book, Understanding by Design. Essentially, rather than starting with a list of content and then teaching it and then thinking later about the assessment, you start on the output end. So rather than thinking about the input, you start about the output. What do you want your students to be able to do at the end of this course? And then you ask yourself, can I think of evidence that I'm going to accept, as an indication that I've accomplished those desired outcomes? And if I can't, I probably should reformulate my outcomes. And lastly, let's think about the instructional approach and the content. So what I did is I surveyed all of the faculty in engineering, chemistry, physics, astronomy, and the physics department who had an introductory physics course requirement for their courses. And I surveyed them and I asked them, first of all, what they expected the students coming out of this course to be able to do. And secondly, because I know that a lot of faculty have trouble formulating their courses in terms of outcomes, I also asked them, what content do you think I should include in the course? Out of this came 3 lists, and I'm not going to show you the details. I'm going to give you a URL where you can download it if you want to see all of the details, but basically 3 lists. One list of overarching competencies that I wanted this course to help my students develop. There's only 7 of them. And I think they're very generic. They're not specific to physics. In fact, there are many other courses that could help students with diagnosis, quantitative or qualitative analysis, or ethics, or collaborative skills. In fact, I would love for my department as a whole to sit down and think, what are the overarching competencies that we want our major, our concentration to contribute to? But I haven't gotten to that point yet, so we have to start somewhere. So at a slightly lower level, I have a slightly longer list. I think it's about 15 or so, course-specific goals. And then I ended up with a third list, which was a much more detailed list. It's basically 6 pages of content-specific goals, how I want my students to be able to apply the content in various contexts. And if you're interested in seeing all of those details, we have a visitor packet for people who visit the course that you can download at that URL. And you don't need to write it all down, because at the end of my talk, I'll give you a URL where you can download the slides, so you have everything. Now, I had taught for most of my career in this classroom in the Science Center at Harvard, seating 500 students, based on architecture developed quite a while back. Who is responsible for this architecture? The ancient Greek, exactly. Why did the Greek develop this architecture? For what?
Speeches.
Speeches, not so much speeches, but you're close. Plays, exactly, theater. It was meant for theater so that everybody could see and everybody could hear. Now, did the Greek actually use the amphitheater to teach? No. They were very smart. They didn't use the performance space as a learning space. If you look at an illustration of the School of Athens, you see people walk around and talk in pairs. In fact, the idea of talking and walking was very important in ancient Greek culture. And it was pairwise interaction. It was not, you know, the sage on the stage. But somewhere in medieval Europe, we adopted the performance space, this is one of them here, as a learning space. And I think a lot of education derailed right then and there. Because if you look at this space, I mean, the mindset that you bring, and think about yourself walking into here and sitting down in those seats just a few minutes ago. You came down and sat down with the expectation, I am going to listen and observe. In fact, in a certain sense, by walking into the space, you're automatically turning into a passive person. Right? I mean, the mindset is, I'm going to sit down, observe, and be quiet, which is the same mindset you'd bring to a movie or a play or a concert. It would be rude in a movie theater to start talking and making noise. And therefore, you bring that same mindset, in a sense, to the classroom, and you turn into a pumpkin, so to speak. This is completely focused on the person at the front. Everybody is looking at the person at the front. It's centered on the faculty, not on the student. And I would argue, in a learning environment, it's a student who is more important than the faculty member, not the other way around. It's also completely focused on information transfer, which is why I developed peer instruction as a way of actually sort of, even though this architecture is not ideal, to put the focus back onto the students. So it became clear to me that I had to get rid of the space too. Now, we had a library above my office, and frankly, I hadn't set foot in that library in 12 years. I mean, who needs libraries, especially when the entire collection is digitized, and Harvard works with Google to digitize its whole collection. So we basically squeezed the books and the librarians into one half of that floor and used the other floor for a classroom, which is actually very nice. It's very sunny, has a huge skylight. It has windows on 3 sides. You only see you actually see the 2 sides of the classroom that have the fewest windows, one that has none at all and one that has 6 windows, of which you see 4. The other sides have even more windows. It's very bright. Now, the windows meant that we could not put any blackboards on the walls or whiteboards or whatever it is. We couldn't put any screens on the walls, nothing. And that was actually a benefit. Initially, we planned all kinds of technological innovations, and we were going to have snap glass on which you can write. And I mean, we were dreaming. And then all of a sudden, somebody said, wait a minute, we really don't know how technology affects learning. So why don't we go to the other extreme, no technology at all? It's about active learning. It's not about technology. And if you stop to think how technology is used in education, it's mostly old wine into new bottles. Do something that's been done since the Middle Ages using technology, and people expect miracles then. Of course, miracles don't happen, and in the end, people don't learn any faster or better. So no technology. Students bring their own technology, as you can see on the tables. And because there was no whiteboard space on the walls, we took these mobile whiteboards. You see a few because for the picture, we actually moved the whiteboards out of the way, which turns out to be a blessing, because now, if you would like to lecture in that room, you can't. Because half the students have their back to you, But on top of that, 80% of them are hidden by a whiteboard. It's absolutely impossible to lecture in that room. It's completely focused on interaction between the students and on the students themselves. They're facing each other at these tables that can be easily rearranged. Now, in terms of pedagogical approach, having sort of pioneered the flipped classroom, it's clear that I was going to do that here too, meaning that rather than providing the first exposure to the material in the classroom, essentially regurgitating the textbook, and then sending the students to their rooms to have, to get a deeper understanding of the material on their own, I flipped the two around and did the first exposure to the students in the rooms, and then used the time in class with the students to build a deeper, and to help the students build a deeper understanding of the material. So, no lectures, no exams. I was walking past some of your classrooms here on taking the escalator up, seeing these poor students taking exams. If you want to know about my views of exams, I've changed it radically. I really think that exams are just a modern form of hazing. And one that really doesn't tell us very much about people's future success. I would like to challenge you. One of these days, why don't you step into one of those rooms and take the exam in one of the fields that you're active in? I bet that many of you would be horrified by your own performance. Yet, we're successful, so what does the ability to take an exam really say about people's future success? Anyway, I don't have time to get into much more detail, but on my website, ericmazur.com, I have a video of a talk that I'm starting to give more and more because I think it's a really important point, with the title, Assessment, the Silent Killer of Learning, which basically argues that our assessment practices are really not accomplishing the things that we really want. They're not telling us who is going to be successful and who is not going to be successful. What's worse, it's making our students risk averse. And creativity and innovation require failure and risk. So if you're not comfortable with failing, you will never be truly innovative. So you may want to watch that talk if you want to understand the no exams part. So there are three major components in this class. One is, that doesn't mean there's no assessment. There's a lot of assessment in my class. There's simply no high-stakes exams that put people in a situation that they're never going to encounter in their real life. I mean, I looked through the window there, so the students separated from one another. The only thing on the table was a pencil. They're not even allowed to bring. In the US now, when students get tested, they can't even bring their watch anymore in class because it could be a smartwatch. Soon we'll have to take the exams naked because you're laughing. I don't think it's funny at all. Anyway, so what I was going to say is, in your real daily life, do you ever encounter a situation where you're cut off from anybody else and from any source of information? When I write a paper about nanophotonics, I can look up whatever I want. There's not somebody standing next to my computer saying, you're not allowed to look up that paper by your colleague at Yale. You should have known it by heart. It's not about memorizing the information. It's about knowing how to use it. And in fact, all of the information I need and I carry in my brain right now, I learned actually after graduating. Nanophotonics didn't exist when I was a PhD student. And I know it now not because somebody told me, Eric, you should memorize this, it's good for you. No, I know it because I use it. Anyway. Enough about examinations. It's just that I got sort of all fired up when I took the escalator up and I saw the students there. So anyway, so this course has three major components: the information transfer out of class, the projects, and then the in-class activities. I'm going to discuss those three now. So I thought a lot about this out-of-class component. Of course, when I flipped the classroom back in 1991, I started, telling the students to read, and then I used in-class quizzes. I'd done many different things just-in-time teaching. I'd gone back and forth between video and text. For this class, I think I finally nailed it. I decided, first of all, not to do video, even though I have a huge collection of videos, because I had looked at some of the statistics from edX and from pre-lectures that were given that are published by the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. And you look at it and you find that with video, what students do is they try to get through it even faster than they get through a lecture. They put the playback speed at 1.3, 1.5, and maybe the first 2 videos they watch the whole 20 minutes, and then after a while they find out that they can actually just watch 3 minutes and then skip to the multiple choice questions and then just answer them enough times until they pass the test and they're done, which is really not what we want to accomplish. See, the problem is with a lecture or with video, you're not in control of the flow of information. Right? In a lecture, your brain is in a sense held captive by the speaker, me in this case. If at some point you're starting to wonder about something, your mind will wander and you can no longer listen to the information coming in. I don't know about you, but I certainly have never had a student raise his hand in class and say, "Professor Mazur, could you please be quiet for 5 minutes? I need to think." You're laughing, but stop to think about it. If you need to think, that's what you should really do, right? Because as your mind wanders, you're no longer listening to the incoming information. So you have sort of a, you can think very superficially, of course, but if you really wonder, about something that is a cognitive dissonance or requires some deeper thinking, you can't listen at the same time. Our brains are not made for multitasking. Now, with video, in principle, you could stop and think, let me wonder about this, or let me make a sketch, or whatever. But, students don't do that. They bring the habits that they have in a lecture room to the video. Now, with reading, it's different, right? Because when you read, if you read and your mind wanders, you stop reading automatically. You are in control of the flow of information. So after pondering this for a while, I said, you know what, I'm going to use my book. I've written a new book anyway, so, well, it was still in production then, but why don't I use that? But how do you get students to read? And the key to that was to use a social document annotation system, turning the text into a living document that permits the students to interact with one another. So they get the hard copy of the book, or, for the last 3 years they actually got a photocopy because it was not yet in print. And at the same time, they get access to an electronic copy. If they don't understand something, they just drag a rectangle over what they don't understand and they type, "I don't understand why, blah, blah, blah." And other students who read the text see that faint outline and they can hover the cursor over it and then it turns dark, and if they click on it, they see what's going on. They can answer that question. So here on 25th of February, one student says, "Yeah, this is where I'm confused from the first paragraph, blah, blah, blah." A day later, student 2 said, "Maybe they're trying to say that there's no obvious motion, but," and so on. 4 days later, student 3, "I agree that the motion is not obvious," and so on. Then student 2 comes back in a few hours later. So basically, the students asynchronously help each other understand the text, which is an intrinsic motivation to continue to contribute to this, right? Because if you don't understand something, you can put it down and somebody else will help you understand it. Now, an intrinsic motivation is ideal, but not obviously sufficient when you have non-majors like I have. So there has to be some kind of an extrinsic motivation too, which I'll tell you in just a second about. But using a combination of intrinsic and extrinsic motivating factors, we get now 20,000 annotations in one course. 20,000 annotations with 70 students. This is more text than I have written in a textbook. I took 24 years. They take one semester. How do I get them to put so many annotations in? Well, I found that the best way to get students to do something is to give them a rubric. Develop a rubric and give it to them. I was once giving a talk about my course and about the development of rubrics, and now And this was in Latin America, and I said, and I'm giving my students the rubric, and one professor says, "What? You're actually giving your rubric to the students?" I said, "Yes, why not?" He says, "Well, but then they know exactly what to do." So the rubric has 3 criteria. The first one is quality. The annotation has to be thoughtful and demonstrate interpretation of the text. So that's the first one. The second criterion, so if a student just writes, "I don't understand this," 0 point. Everything in my class is graded on a 3-point scale. 0 means deficient, 1 means needs improvement, 2 means meets expectations, and 3, which I very, very rarely give, means exceeds expectation. And for this rubric, there is not even a 3. So if they just write, "I don't understand this," it's 0. If they write, "I don't understand this because on page 256, blah, blah, blah," I know at least that they've read another page, so they get 1 point. If they write down, "I don't understand this because when you combine what's written on 256 and then it reveals the thinking," right, then they get 2 points. They have to have a certain quantity, between 7 and 20, thoughtful annotation. So if they're 1s, you better put more, and if they're 2s, you can do fewer annotations. Since students don't know very much, they tend to err on the greater quantity. And initially, we didn't have the distribution requirements, only to discover that the students put all their annotations in the first 3 pages and then said, "I'm done." But now they have to be distributed. So if you only annotate 3 of the 30 pages, you get 10% of the credit. And then they have to be timely. Now, the last 2 criteria is, of course, easily machine computed. As the class grew and the number of annotations grew, it became an impossible task to do number 1 by hand. So I got together with a machine learning expert and a colleague of mine who does basically statistical analysis of social media, is an expert on processing social media, tweets in particular. And these annotations, go back to here, are actually not that different from tweets. They're the same lengths. There's been a lot of work done in machine grading, which is not very good. But that's basically because people try to grade essays and so on, and I think computers are not that great yet at grading those. But for this, it works absolutely fantastically. So this is completely automated now. I don't have to do anything. And let's show you the schedule basically very briefly. This is the reading schedule for this past semester. The chapters are at the bottom and they're in units. And each chapter has a deadline. So before coming to class on February 29, the students have to read chapter 22 to get full credit. But as in real life, you can't always make all deadlines. So we have a sliding deadline, and we don't want to discourage people from reading the chapter right after the deadline. So if they can't make the chapter deadline, they can still, for half credit, submit annotations until the unit deadline. Now, annotations fall into 3 categories. Comments, this is cool. Questions, can somebody explain this to me? And answers, here's the explanation. We don't want to discourage answers from coming in if a question is posted right at the deadline. So answers get an additional 3 days. So if I post a question by the deadline, then anybody else can still get full credit by posting an answer 3 days later. And again, this is of course completely automated. You just upload the schedule, and then it's done. It's done automatically. We can get 95% of the students to complete 100% of the readings. And the remaining 5% may have missed 1 or 2. It's pretty amazing. I'm really happy because this nailed the out-of-class component in a way that I've never been able to accomplish before. Let's talk briefly about the projects, because that's the Trojan horse. We have 1 project per month. I initially thought, is there a way that I can capture everything with 1 project? But I couldn't think of folding the entire curriculum into 1 project. So I basically ended up with 1 project per month, which means there are 6 over the 2 semesters. We form new teams. So if the 5 of us here work together on project 1, we're guaranteed not to work together on any of the other projects. I learned things from working with the four of them. If they tell me, Eric, you should come to class more on time, in the feedback that I get at the end, I know that in order not to get burned by my next team, I should show up on time. This also prevents, which sometimes happens with project and team-based learning, you know, our ability to form teams is relatively limited. I don't want to have students get into a team that doesn't work well and that affect the entire semester. It's very unlikely that you'll get into 3 teams that are not working well. The projects are open-ended, which means if there are 14 teams working on a project, the eventual outcome will look very different for each team. Even though the subject is the same, you know, whatever they build or present is going to be very different. And that's important because that means it leaves room for creativity. And the creativity is part of the ownership. The other thing, and I think this is something I learned over the course of the years, is you have to make the project so hard that there's not a single individual in the class who can do it on his or her own. They depend on each other. If they don't work together well, the project is going to sink. There's a lot of people who do team-based learning and don't take that rule into account. And then what happens is that the better students simply take over from the weaker students. They get annoyed at the weaker students because they have to support them. No, you have to make it so hard that they absolutely need each other. It's a crucial design rule of team-based learning. We have 3 different types of fairs. Some where they build something, poster presentation is another one, and one where we had oral presentations, but then that became, as the class grew, it became more difficult, so we ended up having them make 3-minute YouTube videos. Initially, I was the one who evaluated the projects, but then I discovered, boy, I have a conflict here. Most of the year, I'm their coach. I'm trying to coach them to be the best they can be, and at the fair, I make this Jekyll and Hyde transition and say, bye, I'm going to judge you now. I wanted to give them all A+. So now what I do is I ask my colleagues to come and judge. This also validates what I'm doing in my class in their eyes, and I'll be happy to return the favor to them. So they come at the fair, which is usually a festive opportunity. Now, in order to design successful projects, I learned a lot from the business school at Harvard, which makes a killing out of designing cases. They've used the case-based study method for more than 40 years, and they actually have design rules for those cases. There are 3 design rules, and it turns out just replace the word case by project, and you have good design rules for a project. The first one is that the case, in my case, the project, has to test the practical application of skills. So let's say you teach a finance class. Well, you might want your students to be able to determine the market capitalization of a company or to determine a reasonable stock price at an initial public offering. Well, that's easily translated to physics, right? I want my students to be able to apply, let's say, Newton's laws to this or that situation. The second one is the case, in my case, the project, has to be linked to real-world problems. So what does the business school do? They go to the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times. They look at some real companies and real cases, and then they change the names of the companies so that the students can't Google it. How do you do that in physics? Well, I mean, step into a physics teaching lab, and yeah, what's there might look like the real world in the eyes of a physicist, but I don't know about you, I don't have that type of, you know, frictionless tracks and equipment and so on in my kitchen. So, you know, to the student, it doesn't really look like the real world. So it became clear that I had to abandon every investment ever made into laboratory equipment because that was not really, you know, the real world. Yes, it is the real world from a physicist's point of view, but from a layperson, it's not. So that was a little bit difficult in the beginning, but then, you know, just look around us. The whole world is full of physics, right? So you just have to let your imagination flow. The third rule, which turns out to be probably the most important one, was the one that stumped me the most at first. And it is that the case, and then again in my case the project, has to have a component of empathy or social good. So that, you know, they feel that they're doing something beneficial for others. So the business school will say, you know, each case will, first of all, address the students and put them in a position to do some good. You have been appointed to help a family invest an inheritance, blah, 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 and so on. Oh, how do you do that with physics? Again, it required me to completely change my mindset and approach. I'm going to give you an example. Here are the 6 projects, and I'm going to just discuss one of them because I think that probably embodies the 3rd criterion better than any other one. So at the beginning of each project, the student receives a brief. So as they go into the class, on the table are the briefs, which is a 15-page document. At that URL that I gave you there, there's one brief, the one for the Rube Goldberg machine. But I'm happy to share them all with you. It's a 15-page document that lays the context, puts down the physics requirements, and then basically gives all the rubrics and all the logistics, where they can get resources and so on. So it's a brief for the entire project. This is for the part of the course that deals with oscillation waves and sound. And the context is El Sistema in Venezuela. How many of you are familiar with El Sistema in Venezuela? Absolutely nobody? I think there's even an El Sistema Melbourne, I heard, in some of the poorer neighborhoods here. But anyway, El Sistema started 50 years ago, in 1965, in Caracas, by an economist by the name of Jose Abreu, who realized that who had the idea of fighting street poverty by putting kids after school in a classical orchestra. Started in his garage, and then now there's something like 400,000 Venezuelan kids in something like 350 youth orchestras. It's one of the few things that's still working in Venezuela. And you know, it has yielded some miracles. Gustavo Dudamel, who is the conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic, product of El Sistema. The first violinist of the Berlin Philharmonic, product of El Sistema. A couple of famous jazz musicians, products of El Sistema. So as the students walk in and they find this brief on their page, I take about 10 minutes to provide an introduction to the project. And it turns out there are some beautiful documentaries that have been made by El Sistema, so I show them a few clips.
My 3rd night of being in Venezuela, we heard a concert of Gustavo Dudamel conducting the Teresa Cranial Youth Orchestra. I literally have the hair stand up on the back of my neck.
I showed them a little bit more of this documentary. In particular, I showed them a part where it shows what they do in the early grades. There's not enough money to buy instruments for 500,000 kids, or close to 500,000 kids in Venezuela. So grades 1 through 3, the students basically built their own instruments from cardboard that don't make any sound, and the teacher, you know, turns on a boombox that, you know, Beethoven's Eroica or whatever, and you know, the students basically play their mute instruments. So they learn how to hold their instruments and participate in music without really making music. The task to my students is design beautifully sounding musical instruments from just recycled parts. Now, of course, they're also, and in order to show them that can actually be done, I showed them another little video YouTube clip that went viral 3 years ago. You may have seen it, the Paraguayan Landfill Harmonic. It's about a town in Paraguay near a landfill where the kids go rummage around in the landfill and then assemble instruments from the parts they find there. There's in particular this one clip of a student playing a cello. He plays Bach's unaccompanied cello suites on a cello made from an oil drum. I mean, you close your eyes and you can't believe that it is a homemade cello made from an oil drum. It's amazing. Anyway, kids are all fired up after that, right? Because some will come to me and say, if we design a good instrument, can we actually get it to El Sistema? So who do you appoint as judges? Well, I go to the music school at Harvard, and it turns out there's a Longy School of Music near Harvard, which is a fairly well-known music school, where there's a faculty member who is a world-renowned clarinetist, and he happens to have an undergraduate physics degree from Harvard, and he has a connection to El Sistema. I just couldn't be better. No? Now, where's the physics? Well, in the brief, it tells them that they'll have to determine what the musical range of the instrument is and what limits the musical range of the instruments. What is the Q factor of it? What is the harmonic spectrum? What sets the harmonic spectrum? And how could they improve the harmonic spectrum in order to get a more pleasing sound? What is the sound level? Is it enough in order to play in an orchestral setting? What is the tuning stability? I mean, the fair will last 3 hours. Will it remain in tune? How is it going to be affected by things like humidity and temperature and so on? There's a lot of physics there. And it's a lot harder actually than the clean, sterile physics you encounter in a standard laboratory setting where you'd go with a tuning fork, you know, and then it's not that hard to do a Q factor and so on. So what are the milestones? Well, as they walk in, the first half hour we allocate to my introduction, which is 10 minutes, and then the rest they have to start writing a team contract. We give them time to shake hands. I mean, they sit down with people they don't know because we assign them to a specific table, exchange phone numbers, emails, and so on. They have to give their team a name, a mission statement, and they have to write down how they will work together and how they will resolve difficulties. At the beginning, you see these contracts not be very good. If, you know, we can't work together, we'll go and talk to Professor Mazur. Only to find out that when difficulties arise and they come to me with the difficulty, I say, look, you have to resolve it. I can't resolve it for you, right? Just as in real life. So proposal, but they get better over time, which is great because they learn how to work together. After about 1 or 2 weeks, I want a proposal. Make sure that they're not, you know, getting too wild with their expectations and plans, and also that they don't fall into traps that they might encounter. After 3 weeks is fair, which we typically don't do in a classroom. We do it outside in a public space so that other students see it and say, oh, wow, I want to take this class next year. Then a week later, they have to hand in a report. First, it was just a report, but then we discovered students don't know how to write reports. So there should really be an opportunity to learn how to write as well. So now it has to be written in the form of an engineering or science publication. Limited number of words, so many words subtracted per figure, so many words subtracted per displayed equation. It has to be referenced like a real publication and so on. And just as in the real world, they submit it, 1 per team, and then they have 3 days, we give feedback, and they have 3 days to improve it. So we might reject it, or we might say this needs to be improved, or this doesn't meet that standard. And at the end, and this is in order to maintain, and unfortunately I won't be able to talk about this, sort of individual responsibility, we have a team peer and self-assessment where they evaluate each other so that we know how much, and we put them in the prisoner's dilemma there, so that we know how much each individual has contributed to the project. Here's one of the YouTube videos.
We dedicated ourselves to designing a robust, creative, and economical flute for El Sistema. Our flute is 100% recycled, with the wooden dowel, the duct tape, the plastic, and the PVC all from the engineering lab, so our cost is 0. Our design is a modular tripartite design in which we combine 3 flutes in one, as thus we can interchange the different flutes for different notes and different scales.
So it's clear that you need to also distribute musical talent here. So one of the things, we formed a team, so before this project, we actually need to survey, who has played musical instruments, who knows how to read notes, and distribute that equitably among teams. And you can see, I mean, this is only a minute out of the 3-minute video clip, but you get an idea. I don't always nail the empathy, social good aspect as well, but I found the absolute perfect substitute: competition. Here the teams have to build a safe. This is inspired by the Weizmann Institute. This is a safe that consists of 4 wooden sides and 2 transparent. They all get those same 6 parts, and the safe has to be locked by principles of electromagnetism. And during the fair, teams go to a competing team's safe and have 10 minutes to reverse engineer the electronics or electromagnetics that is inside, and then crack the safe open. And the team that whose safe resists the most cracking attempts and manages to crack the most other safes open wins. So what about the in-class activities? Well, in a typical class, I used to have lecture, lab, discussion section, a total of about 6 weeks per hour, 3 weeks of lectures, 2 weeks of lab, 1 week of discussion section. And students go back and forth, and the different components are never really well integrated. I thought I'm going to eliminate that all. I'm just going to have one thing, class, and we put it a little bit better together. We meet twice a week for 3 hours. A long time, but we'll vary the activities inside those 3 hours. And during those 3 hours, we basically put a blend of 6 best practices, color-coded, as you can see. So this is, for example, January 29. We do 90 minutes of the blue stuff, then 30 minutes of the yellow stuff, and an hour of the green stuff, and so on. And you can see 1 project period, 2 project period, 3 project periods. So let's look at 1 project period. You can see that the beginning, all the time is allocated to these scaffolded guided activities. But as time goes by, there's more and more white appearing, where basically we don't have anything programmed in class, because the students will need to start working on putting their project together. They can come to class if they want, and we'll be there to support them. But if they prefer to go to the shop or the library or wherever, or in the coffee shop to work together, that's fine too. At the beginning, we have this team intro where they get to know each other, the contract, I set the stage. The proposal is typically somewhere in the 2nd week. It is evaluated in class. We go around and we make sure that they stay on track. And then at the end, there is the fair. What about the 6 in-class activities? I have limited time to talk about this, so I will only highlight 2 of them. But there are 2. The top one is basically aimed at building understanding, supporting understanding. I forgot to tell you one thing. From the annotation system, I get a report. So before I get into class, I can press on a button, and I see the concepts that give rise to the most thoughtful discussions and questions. So, torque or lever arm or conservation momentum. So it'll list the 3 that give in that chapter the most thoughtful questions. And then it takes 3 exemplars of good questions. Torque, and then, a student's question, and another student. So I don't have to read 1,000 annotations and plow through all of that. I can just click that button, and then before coming to class, I can see what questions the students have. So I can say, well, I'm impressed by all your annotations. I read them, and I noticed that you had most difficulties with topic A, topic B, topic C. Let's look at topic A. Here are some really good questions, and I cut and paste and put it on the slide, right? Connecting, again, the out-of-class component to the in-class component. So understanding, applying your knowledge, and then evaluate your knowledge for the bottom 2. So the first one is actually the closest to what I used to do. It's peer instruction, except that we use it using a platform called Learning Catalytics that does away with multiple choice questions. So I can take these questions that the students have in the annotation, put it on, bounce it back at them, and basically get the answers, have them talk in a team, and answer again. Tutorial, which is basically a worksheet developed by the University of Washington to address documented misconception. We have an estimation activity where they have to develop qualitative thinking skills and learn how to estimate quantities. We run this as a competition. Each team gets a sheet that has 5 estimation questions, or 6 estimation questions. The first team to have all 5 or 6 orders of magnitude correct wins. They don't win anything, but they win. You have no idea what that does to teams. We have an experimental activity where they learn how to use public domain software to do measurements, Tracker to look at motion, Audacity to look at waveforms, Fourier transforms, so that they know how to determine the Q factor for the musical instrument and so on. And then we have problem sets. I want to briefly discuss that. Problem set is the way it always is. It's basically solve a number of problems. You try to connect the problems to the project. But the goal here really is to develop not just problem-solving skills, but also metacognitive skills, the ability to sort of evaluate your own learning. So there are 2 phases. One is solve at home by yourself. I used to tell my students, work together. Now I tell them, do it alone. And the goal is not to get the answer right. Ideally, you get the answer right, but the goal is to develop the skills, and it's evaluated on effort, because the learning will follow the effort, and it's very hard to fake effort. It's very easy to fake correct answers and correct solutions. You copy them from somebody else, or you Google them, or you have somebody else do it for you, but effort you can't. That's 50%. The other 50% is reflecting on your effort in class. And the great thing, it crowdsources the grading too. So it turns out to be less work for us. So at home, they get this rubric for the at-home part. They're only allowed to write in blue or in black. And for each and every problem, I want them to follow this 4-step procedure. Get started, articulate the problem in your own words, and determine what knowledge you're going to apply to solve the problem. Devise a plan. Explain the strategy that you're going to follow follow the problem. Most students never wrote that down in my problem sets. Execute the plan, which is what you typically get when you ask for a problem set. And then evaluate the answer. Use your estimation skills in order to see if your answer makes sense. Now, most students, or a lot of students, get stuck in the execute the plan. That doesn't excuse them from this. If they get stuck here, they still have to use their estimation skills to see what a reasonable range of answers would have been. So I get now solutions the way I've never seen them before, beautifully split into steps. Some students come in with 25 pages. They're just trying to convince me that they've put in the effort. And by doing this, you learn. Getting the right answer, if I looked at the answer, they would cut corners and do whatever is necessary to get the right answer, but I would not be assured of actual learning. Here I can be sure that at least they develop the practices that will lead to learning. So then for the in-class phase, the reflect phase, they basically, we put 5 red pencils on each table, and they're only allowed to use those red pens. If we see anybody use a blue or a black pen, it invalidates the homework right away. My original idea was to put the solutions on the table and a reflection sheet. First time that I did this, students came in and it started saying, much to my relief, they had actually worked hard on their work, even though we did not look at the answer. We told them that we wouldn't look at the answer. And my assistant came in and says, and I said to her, where are the copies of the solution? And she said, what solution? I said, what? I sent it to you 2 days ago. She had failed to copy the solution. I mean, I was ready to commit a murder there. I mean, here I was sticking out my neck, and she had, and we had nothing else to do. I had no idea what I was going to do. But to my surprise, the students just sat down, and the reflection sheet just said, mark up your work with a red pen. It didn't say, but comparing to the solution. So what did students do? They just went to each other and said, what did you have for problem number 2? And then, oh, I had a -2 there. And then, they go to the board, they just start to talk together. 45 minutes later, my assistant came in with a stack of photocopies. So we distributed that, and it completely changed everything. The class turned silent, and now each individual student was comparing solutions to their own work. But the good thing is, by then they had looked at it so much that they found the mistakes in my solutions, right? So they mark up their work in red, and then they write down what they've learned from both the doing and the marking up, and what they need to improve on. And the credit is 50% for each of those two phases. Here's what one student said. I was inspired and encouraged to do these problems on my own with the promise of collaborative work the next day. This student told us that for other courses, he would go an hour before the due date to the boxes where homework is handed in, wait for other students to come and then basically copy. And he said he had to fight that impulse. He said, I don't have to do this for this course because they don't look at the answer. Here's another student. I felt less pressure to find the right answer and more freedom to explore. Isn't that beautiful? I think I'm going to have to skip the readiness assurance activity. It's basically a euphemism for exam. It's really focused on both formative assessment and collaborative learning. Students work together and actually teach each other while taking an exam. I suggest that instead of showing that to you here, you look at my talk on assessment, and that will give you a good idea of this collaborative testing approach. Let me end up in the next few minutes with some results. First of all, ownership. The course evaluation was 4.2 out of 5. This is a course that's not an elective, it's a requirement. I'd never gotten such a high course evaluation for a required course. I've taught both required courses and elective courses. I've had high evaluations for elective courses. For required courses, never been that high. Here's what one student said. The structure of the class made was my least favorite subject into one of my favorites. I was worried that people, including myself, would just slack off and do the bare minimum. But you really need to be on top of your readings and concepts in order to contribute to your team. Great class. Here are another students. Dear Harvard students, this class will be unlike any class you've taken at Harvard, and it will hopefully shift the entire foundation upon which you've based your education. I truly believe everyone should take this course. Now read this. Prepare to take full ownership of your learning. Ownership. I mean, this had been a design criterion, and to get it echoed back in the evaluation, that made my day. The attendance, 94% in the fall, 97% in the spring. This is above the theoretical maximum. Because you get sick students. They drag themselves to school sick. I'll show you an email that reveals why. And the other thing is, initially the classroom was all to myself. There were very few faculty members who wanted to teach. This year, unfortunately, everybody wants to teach in the classroom all of a sudden. So we have to be out. But the first year I taught there, there was no class after me. The students wouldn't leave. I'd take the microphone and say, time to leave. They would ignore me. After 20 minutes, we had to literally shove them out of the classroom in order to clean up. This reveals why students come to class sick. I don't think I'm well enough to make it through class. I feel terrible because I don't want to let my team down by not being there. But I don't think I'd be very helpful in my current state. I have to tell these students, look, your health is more important. Just tell your team that you're sick. Happens in the real world too. Self-efficacy, students' belief in their ability to succeed. I'd measured this in my Physics 11B course for engineers. And the first time I gave it, I noticed that their self-efficacy went down. I called up Joe Reddish at the University of Maryland, who wrote this instrument, and I said, something terrible happened in my class. It went down. He said, by how much? And I showed him. It's actually not even statistically significant. He said, Eric, that's fantastic. I said, what? He said, yeah, usually it plummets. So I learned to regard this as a pretty good result. In AP 50, it actually goes up, and it's statistically significant. It goes up. Students have a strong, even though they're not physicists, they have a stronger belief in an ability to succeed in physics than before. Conceptual mastery, I'm going to skip these results because I'm going to talk about it briefly in my book course, but really I find significant improvement there too. I want to end with this picture that I started with. Look at these students. They're smiling. They're smiling not because they're posing for a photographer. They probably were unaware of the photographer. They were working on that team competition. They had 10 minutes to crack open that safe. They're smiling because they're actually having fun and showing that they have taken ownership of the material. In fact, the word fun appeared over and over and over in the evaluations. I had never seen the word fun for any of my evaluations in introductory physics. You come out with so much knowledge and experience and fun. And isn't that the way education should really be? Thank you.
So questions for Eric. Okay, up here.
Did I get any negative feedback? Well, you get always negative feedback, some. You know, there are some students who want lectures because they think that that's how they learn. They don't realize that in a lecture the only thing they do is take notes and copy information down in their notebook, and they have to do the learning afterwards on their own. So yeah, there's always some, but it's very little. It's very, very, very small. And in part that is also because I advertise this course as one that is project-based and team-based. And so the students and there are other tracks, so the students who take this course tend to be more predisposed at liking this. Also, you know, I only have capacity for 70 or 90 students depending on the classroom, and I have each year around 160 who want to take the course, so I get to cherry pick them too. So that might give a slightly distorted view. But I think that, you know, it's hard not to like this approach. I mean, I think there are very few students who are unhappy at the end of this class. There are some students who wonder about how much they actually learn because they're having fun. And they think that if they're having fun, that they can't be learning. Right? They've worked hard and crammed and then immediately forgotten, of course, material that they took in many classes, and they don't associate learning with fun. They associate learning with stress. And in this course, there is no stress. So there are some students who will come to me halfway through the term and say, I'm actually having a lot of fun, but I'm not sure I'm learning anything. Now, I know, I mean, I skipped over the data here, but I know that their mastery level is higher than in any other course that we've taught at Harvard over the past 6 years. So it shows that people can have this misconception about learning, what learning really means.
Next question here and then here.
So the team-based learning takes into account the ability of the students, but how critical is it for them to come in at a similar level of education? I mean, if you have a wide disparity in their familiarity, say, with mathematical concepts, is it going to sink, or can they help each other?
Did everybody hear the question? So I glossed over the team formation. So the question is about how essential is it that the students come in at the same level? What if there's a disparity in ability? We actually specifically designed the team so that there is a disparity. In fact, we do, over the course of the semester, we keep track of their performance, and we always put a low performer, high performer, and sort of 3 medium performers in a team. That's one of the ground rules of the team design, to maximize the diversity. Beginning of the term, we don't know much about them, so we give them a pre-test where we test their incoming knowledge, and we do the same thing. Low performer, high performer, 3 medium performer, try to keep the average the same for all teams. Why is that? Well, if you take and there's plenty of literature to back this up, if you take a uniform homogeneous team, you find that students have very little to teach each other. Now, let's say, you know, you put a high performer and a low performer in the team, you would say, well, isn't just the low performer gaining at the expense of the high performer? Wait a minute. Who is the person who learns the most in any classroom?
The lecturer.
The lecturer. So in a sense, you provide an opportunity for the better students to become the teacher. And they will gain because, you know, they get to articulate their thinking. And as we know from teaching, by articulating thinking, you learn. So it's not just that you bring in the low performers up to the level of the high performers. No, it's a win-win situation.
So another question here.
On the same lines, but students get to choose the project, or do you assign them? You assign them a project.
So the question is on the same, along the same line, do the students choose the projects or do I assign them? No, I assign the project. So for the symposium, for the musical instruments project, all of the students get the same brief. They all have to make a musical instrument, but some will make a string instrument, others will make a flute. I mean, the embodiment of the musical instrument can be very different. They all have to satisfy the same physics requirements, so they will all have to determine the Q factor and so on. With a stringed instrument, it's relatively simple, but with a flute, you know, you got to learn a little bit more about Fourier transforms in order to do that. You know. But you know, they all end up with a musical instrument. So we'll have 14 musical instruments at the fair if we have 70 students.
Another question at the back and then down here at the front. Yeah.
My question's on the cost of the changes. Are they comparable, or have you had to get extra funding for this course?
So the question is about the cost. Is the cost of implementation comparable to a standard course, or is it more or less? I mean, I don't know if you want to include the design of the classroom. The classroom was actually relatively cheap because we ended up on purpose the only thing we invested in was really good high broadband Wi-Fi, so that we could even stream individual video to every single laptop in the classroom, although we don't use that. That's literally the only technology that is in the classroom. So the classroom was actually relatively cheap compared to many other classrooms that are full of technology that gets outdated in, you know, well, by the time it gets installed, so to speak. In terms of implementation, the staffing is the same. You know, as in, I don't get a bigger allocation of help than I would if I taught an ordinary course. We basically get a quarter teaching assistant for every 10 students. That's the rule at Harvard. And in terms of the projects, I mean, there are a couple of projects. The recycled instruments, I mean, they got to find recycled parts, so I don't have to give them any support. For the Rube Goldberg machine, which is the first project in the fall, we give them $50 per team, right, to buy parts, which we then recycle. Basically, you know, at the end we take the Rube Goldberg machines apart and then we put it all in big boxes, and it turns out that the students the following year want pretty much the same type of, you know, balls and carts and things and PVC pipes and so on. So and of course it's not per student, it's divided by a team of 5. So we have a small budget that we use for things to construct the projects, but I would say that budget is probably a lot smaller than that of a standard physics instruction laboratory, which has all kinds of very expensive equipment.
We'll have to go to the last
In terms of work, because I mean there's investment in money, but there's also investment in work, which is very important, right? Time. This course is great because you can recycle everything. You've in a sense, you've taken away all abilities to cheat by the way I've done it. I can use the same project. I can use the same problem sets. I can use everything the same the next year without having to worry about students copying work from each other or coming up with the same musical instruments. Originality is one criterion. So if you just have the same musical instrument as last year, you know, it's not original. So you're not going to score high on that category. So I mean, I had to invest quite a bit of effort up front, but once I had that, it was done. Annotations, graded automatically. The RAAs, which I didn't discuss, graded automatically. The problem sets, it's more or less crowd graded by them. They grade their own work. I just need to quickly check whether or not they've put in the effort. So I think that in terms of work, it's front-loaded, but once you've invested the effort, and I'm happy to share every effort I've invested, it more or less runs by itself.
So just the last question here.
It's two sort of short questions to me. The first is, given that the structure is so different to what the students have encountered before, what you have to do to kind of prepare them, you know, for the change of mindset. And the second is about diversity. What steps you take to sort of protect against issues of equality or identity, you know, in this sort of group work?
Yeah. The first question I had to do was, you know, how do you change the mindset of the students? Especially Harvard students. How have they gotten into Harvard? By using their elbows, by doing extremely well at cramming and passing all kinds of tests. I mean, they have to do something more than just that, because they have to somehow distinguish themselves by doing something special that distinguishes from the other 20,000 students applying for 1,500 positions at Harvard. But you know, they excel at the standard approach to learning. So I take the first lecture basically to motivate what I'm doing. First of all, I advertise the course as a project-based and team-based course, but then I motivate the method. That whole first 3-hour period I devote to motivating them. And also I do a quick team building exercise where I push them completely out of their comfort zone. I can briefly describe it. Basically, I give a talk that has some elements of the talk I gave to you to sort of motivate them for the course. And then halfway through, I have them all walk to the wall and line them up on the outer wall. So now they're all standing there. You know, they come to class typically with friends and then sit at the same table, right, forming the worst possible teams you could possibly imagine. Right? It's worse than random, okay? So they get up from the table and then they stand next to their friends on the wall. On my iPhone, I have a list of 14 animals: dog, cow, pig, crocodile, flamingo, and so on. So I walk in front of them and give them an animal assignment. Because they're next to their friends, they're guaranteed to have 2 different animal assignments, right? So after 2 minutes, I've gone around and they're all standing there with some animal assignment. And I say, now, you know, you got to find each other. And, you know, for us humans, that would be easy because we have language. But you're not allowed to use language. You can try to fly, you can jump, you can make sounds. You can see some that totally freeze up. You know. Now I have to be a crocodile. You know. But then there's always a few who, you know, jump on tables, start acting like a monkey, and then, you know, within 1 minute, it's complete chaos. And after a few minutes, you have 4 barking dogs here and 5 mooing cows there. So then, you know, I put signs on the table, and I actually do a little team competition. That's the first thing I do. And then immediately I launch into estimation activities, because estimation activities actually is a thread throughout the entire course. So I have them estimate a few quantities. I have a big jar, this big, completely filled with M&Ms, and the team that can, without getting too close to the jar, gets an estimate that is closest to the actual number of M&Ms in the jar, wins the jar of M&Ms. And so I sort of get them immediately in the mode of forming a new team, getting to know new people, and then, you know, a little competition. Because I can't get them to read something before the first class. So, and then we launch into it, and that's why. So now about the grouping, and so as I said, I maximize diversity. I make sure the only thing that I can easily address is gender. Physics tends to be a male-dominated discipline. So I don't want teams with 1 female students and 4 male students. So that's one of the rules that goes into the design. We use linear programming to design the team. So we upload lots of data: gender, year in college, self-efficacy, attitude towards learning, right? We don't want 5 students who all think Professor Mazur should really lecture us. He's not doing his job there in front of the class, right? Because if you're 5 like-minded people like that in a team, they're only going to reinforce each other. So I spread them out according to their attitudes towards learning dimension. So in terms of gender, because that's the only sort of minority issue that I can really easily address, I make sure that I have no single gender teams. So no all male and all female, because it turns out those are the worst performing teams. And no teams with 1 female and 4 male.
Swinburne production.